Ocean bathymetry is the foundation of marine science, and today I'd like to discuss how it relates to marine spatial planning, conservation and mining. My name is Errol Wiles, a marine geologist at the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity. Multibeam bathymetry is a hydrographic survey technique that uses sonar to calculate depth based on the two-way travel time between the sound source and the sea floor. Multibeam bathymetry relies on high accuracy position and motion records to calculate where the vessel is in space. It does this by using numerous satellite bands to accurately locate the vessel during acquisition of data. Seafloor depth comes from soundings, which are controlled by an inertial motion unit, which removes vessel motion and sea motion from the data. The result is a swath of seafloor that's covered with sound, which represents depth at a particular X and Y location. So the insonified area is your depth ping that you'll get back as a data record. During a typical hydrographic survey, you'll collect hundreds of thousands of XYZ points for position and depth. These are then processed and combined into a model of the seafloor. And this model has significantly fewer artifacts and errors than low-resolution seafloor models such as GEBCO, which means it's inherently more useful to various user groups and stakeholders. It describes not only the shape of the seafloor, but also speaks to its composition. You're able to quantify various types of seafloor in a region, and has multiple outputs that we'll discuss as we go. So how does this relate to marine spatial planning? Well, bathymetry is what we're trying to plan spatially. It describes the seafloor. And if we're looking for informed evidence-based decision making, we need to be working with the best data at hand. And high resolution multibeam bathymetry is the best way of describing the seafloor as a base layer, as a foundation to work from. We're looking to unlock the ocean economy. We want society to engage with the ocean. We want to have healthy ecosystems and good ocean governance. And all of this stems from understanding what we have in the first place. We want to quantify the seafloor in terms of reef, unconsolidated sediment, types of reef. And this is what multibeam bathymetry can bring to marine spatial planning. Within marine science in general, we're trying to conduct research. We're trying to sample areas. We want to understand how ecosystems function and how they add value to our lives. We want to provide food security. We want to protect areas through conservation. We've got moorings for scientific research, for industrial purposes, oceanographic sampling, mining. There are a whole host of stakeholders involved in the marine space. And this is only going to get greater as time progresses, especially as we try and extract more value from the economy. So how do we achieve all these goals, and how do we monitor progress in the marine space in whatever aspect we're working on? Multibeam bathymetry allows us to see the seafloor. It allows us to quantify how much seafloor we have. It shows us how much of it is reef, how much of it is sand. We can then break it down further into the types of reef and the types of sand. Is it rugged? Is it low relief reef? Are they large bed forms or small bed forms? Are they current generated and mobile? Are they static? It brings a whole new perspective to marine spatial planning, that you can actually see what you're planning and you can quantify it. And this extends into any of the various facets of marine spatial planning. It could be towards mining, understanding how the seafloor is in the mining area. It could be used for monitoring to see the impact of conservation efforts in an area. It could be used just to quantify how much reef you had, if that reef has a value to the economy. At the basin scale, macrotopography controls the shape of the seafloor. It describes everything from large ridges like the Voltus and Madagascar ridges, abyssal plains, abyssal hills, seamounts. Those are all considered macrotopography, and those restrict or allow movement of deep and bottom water currents and control the lateral movement of surface currents. So things like the Voltus Ridge are critical in controlling North Atlantic deep water flow. The Mozambique Ridge also restricts North Atlantic deep water flow. The Agulhas is limited in how far it can move up against the east coast of South Africa. Antarctic bottom water is restricted to depths below 4,500 meters. So any bathymetry that shoals shallower than that restricts its movement and forces it to turn around and enter back into deeper waters. So this is critical understanding thermohaline circulation and relates to transfer of nutrients and transfer of waste, anything else that gets entrained by these currents. From macrotopography to microtopography, we can go from regional scale to local scales within that macrotopographic framework. In this case, off Mozambique, you've got the Baraha, which creates a high plateau, which constrains the Mozambique undercurrent and forces it up against a steepened flank. This starts to develop microtopography in a region. So anything from outcrop and reef to bed forms are described by the microtopography and are related to the composition of the sea floor. In this case, the Mozambique undercurrent is eroding portions of the lower slope and redistributing those sediments into the abyssal plain, creating undulations in the form of bed forms. Marine resources are all associated with the macro and micro topography of a region. So everything from oil and gas to diamonds, nodules, aquaculture and fisheries, biopharmaceuticals are all associated with a particular piece of seafloor or area, and that area is defined by certain characteristics which are described by bathymetry, whether it's the sedimentary characteristics, the reef characteristics, combination. They're all associated with that geospatial context, and we need to understand that in order to manage impacts and manage resources. And we need to manage it so that we can maximize the societal benefit and societal gain, but we need to do that in a responsible manner. We need to encourage a positive interaction with the ocean rather than one of pure exploitation. And understanding the bathymetry and being able to quantify its value lets you really understand benefits and gains that you're getting and assess whether they're worth it or not, or whether you need to have alternatives or more stringent control over use of certain areas. And this speaks to the third element of marine spatial planning, which is ocean governance. We need to manage the ocean space as well as we possibly can and ensure healthy marine ecosystems while we're doing it. For all those services that the ocean provides just by being there, we can't have those degrade to the point where it's no longer offering those services to us. That would be at the detriment to society at large, which is not an ideal situation to be walking ourselves into while we're trying to maximize economic gain. But we must also bear in mind that those three spheres of influence are not two-dimensional. They exist in a three-dimensional space, and there are various levels and resolution that you need to work at. So ideally, we need to be working with a high-resolution question, high-resolution methods, and high-resolution data to understand a local scale situation before we downscale it up into a low-resolution regional marine spatial plan. And this extends from mining, where certainly the mining industry values multibeam bathymetry data to understand their mining claims. It helps define the resources, it provides spatial context, it describes the sediments that are in a region. It can also help inform where sediments might end up if they're entrained by local currents. In terms of fisheries, it's a similar story where the fisheries exist in regions because of the marine habitat, and that marine habitat exists because of the bathymetry. It provides certain elements required to keep the ecosystem going, and we need to understand how reef roughness and relief affects the species that live there. We need to understand how the variations in sediment grain size across a region impact the ecosystem, which has an impact on prawn fisheries, for example. But you can't do that if you haven't got a solid base layer in the form of multibeam data. The challenges to marine spatial planning are certainly not insignificant, especially when you're trying to maximize economic gain. But they're even more so when you're trying to do this with an ecosystem-based approach, which offers a more balanced solution to exploitation and conservation. And to do this, you need appropriate research methods and appropriate resolution. I find largely what's lacking from these sorts of research projects and understanding is geospatial context. We lack the ability to quantify resources, we lack the ability to quantify ecosystems, we lack the ability to quantify marine habitats, just in terms of spatial extent as well as value to the economy. And it's very hard then to monitor impacts to these zones if you can't quantify them and you don't know where they are. However, this is changing, and we're seeing some great work coming out that considers multibeam bathymetry and hydroacoustic data in understanding marine habitats. We also see that ecosystem-based approaches are starting to work with multiple scales and multiple levels within their planning and research, which is an excellent way to move forward and understand local context before extrapolating it across regions. Using multibeam data as a base, there are various derivatives that we can pull out of the bathymetry data. Things like rugosity, relief, aspect, exposure to currents, exposure to waves. There are various components that are useful to understanding marine habitat and marine ecosystems and allow us to quantify these different facets of marine habitat. Marine spatial planning isn't a piece of cake, but if we look at it the way that geologists look at the world, it is a series of layers with some mixing. At the base, we have bathymetry data, which allows us to select sites and understand the geospatial context of an area. Below that, we might have seismics to look at the evolution of an area. But above it, and from selecting sites on the multibeam data itself, we can look at reef habitat, we can look at the marine fauna and flora that live in an area. We can choose sediment sampling sites. We can understand wave exposure or exposure to currents. And we can add many different levels and variables to research. The goal being that our cake has as many layers as possible at a highest resolution possible to develop a meaningful and holistic marine spatial plan at a regional scale as well as at a local scale. And one of the primary concerns with marine spatial plans is that a global scale generalization could very easily underestimate the spatial temporal diversity of controlling mechanisms, and certainly one of those controlling mechanisms is the bathymetry of the sea floor. Thank you very much for your time.